to say, Danny? Should I introduce him that?
I I I was going to say yesterday I was in Arizona. Sorry, I couldn't turn right instead of going straight on to California.
What were you doing
But
in Arizona?
crossing from Texas to California.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. That's a terrible drive.
No, it wasn't so bad. It was long, and uh, Fort Stockton was kind of not so great, but where we stopped one night.
Yeah, Port Stockton's not a great place. I'm not real fond of El Paso. And sometimes if there's a dust storm, the road on I-10 can be really bad.
I saw the signs, but we had no trouble. Clear weather all the way.
Good.
But the workshop I was teaching in Austin was about Shiny in our studio
Oh
and
no.
our Markdown. And it's an interesting question whether students should learn it. It depends on where the students are heading, I think.
Yeah, most of them are, it's an introductory stats class, so they're pretty much not heading necessarily where, some of them aren't going to really do much statistics. So I just don't know if I want to get them into that or not.
Yeah, no, it's a question of how much writing they do.
Right. And they do a fair amount of writing in my class, but they also, I don't know, maybe I'll think about it. It's not hard to do.
No, no, but they have to have a computer, and without knowing your students, it's impossible for me to say. But
Yeah. By the way, you're a little sometimes maybe it's my connection isn't that great.
is it the voice or the audio or the video?
It's the audio.
Yeah, the audio is kind of a little lagging at times. Like it'll just kind of. I mean, it's fine right now, but sometimes it's kind of cutting back, like a little behind. It seems like.
Yeah, this is, I think, what you call crummy hotel internet.
Ah, that's always fun places. Yes. I've had lots of those.
We have one person waiting. We had a few more in, but they might have just jumped out for a second. So I said we just wait a few more minutes and then we can go ahead and get started.
Oh, but my clock is not even 10 o'clock, so.
Yeah, we're about 3 minutes out.
Sorry. Gotta get the yawning done now.
I know.
All right.
I have my trusty dog.
Oh, nice. Your dog came with you to Austin? Or Houston, actually?
Danny, are you still with us?
Danny, do we lose you?
Seems like we may have lost him for a second. Okay.
All right, well, let's see if he comes back. I am having a hard time getting the Zoom stuff to show me.
Are you in full screen mode? You might not be able to see. If you only have one screen, then you might not be able to see.
I have two screens, but it's not.
Or you're not able to see your Zoom side?
I'm not able to always see how many people are on. So I was just checking to see.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, it's 10 o'clock. Let's give it another minute and see if a few more people show up, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah, hopefully we can get Danny back in that time.
Danny, can you hear us? All right, welcome back, Danny.
Thank you. I didn't have trouble with the internet last night, but I seem to be doing something different today.
All right, well, as you say, it's hotel internet. That's always in free. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So I want to welcome you to the MAA webinar. We're going to be talking today about introducing your students to multivariable data. So the MAA will be recording this webinar so that we can show it again and you can watch it again, I should say. So this is just their policy on that. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. You can ask them in the chat. You can also, Devaney, are we able to unmute them if we want to?
Yes, if you want to be unmuted for any reason, just raise your hand. They have the option to raise your hand. I can do it that way, or you can just put a message in the chat and we can unmute you that way. But everybody does start off muted.
Okay. And then we will be monitoring the chat window. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. At the end of the webinar, we will have a survey to talk about, to get your input on the webinar program. And again, this webinar, which is on January 25th, is on introducing your students to multivariable data. Those are the presenters. The next slide, we'll go ahead and introduce it, but we are, this is our date of our webinar. This is our webinar. So my name is Kate Kozak. I'm one of the presenters. I'm at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, Arizona. Danny, do you want to introduce yourself?
And I'm Danny Kaplan. I teach at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. But as it happens, I'm on the road today, and so I have somewhat dicey hotel internet. So if I drop out, I'll be back soon as I can connect again. But welcome to everyone.
And then Devaney, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Devaney Brown. I work at MAA headquarters, and I'll be monitoring the chat window and the Q&A box.
All right, and then if you could please put your information, introduce yourself either by your name and college, either through the chat room, or if you want to be unmuted, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give everybody the option to talk if you would like. And all you have to do is unmute your mic if you would like to introduce yourself that way instead of putting it in the chat box. So at this point, you guys should be able to unmute yourselves and introduce yourself.
Great.
We have Joe, Christine, and Martin.
So do anybody want to introduce where you're from?
Looks like Christine's about to go.
Okay.
Martin says, hi, I'm Marty Cooksey from Renton Technical College.
Welcome.
Joe says, Joe Royce from St. Paul, Minnesota. I don't have a mic or camera on my computer at the moment. No problem, Joe. St. Catherine University. And he may be having problems with her mic as well. So let's see if she puts something in the chat in a moment.
Okay. All right, well, welcome everyone.
Christy Palat from St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Welcome.
Welcome, Christy.
So our webinar today, we're going to be looking at multivariable data using 2 different class lessons that were created by the StatPREP leadership team. So what I need to first do is give you an overview of the statprep.org website. And then we're going to talk about the first day lesson and then collecting data with something called a globe toss. So the class lessons, they're in the StatPREP website, and I would like to go to that website. It's just statprep.org. You go to that website. And this is what our website looks like. We have different pieces on here. We have a home button, of course. We have the webinars that talk, I'm sorry, not the webinars, the hubs that talk about where we're going to be meeting. Our next few hubs are going to be and what dates they're going to meet. We also have a webinar series where you can go back and watch any of our previous webinars. So this recording will also be put in that webinar series. You can also apply for one of our workshops. There are resources, which is where we're going to be going, but I want to point out a few more of the things. We have a little bit of information about us, which talks about where StatPREP came from, and then what the team looks like, and then some links to the MAA and AMATIC and the ASA, because we're all part of this grant working on this. And then we also have newsletters, so you can click on here and see the newsletters we've put out so far. And but I want to go back to resources. We have in resources little apps that you can use in your classes to kind of demonstrate different concepts. We also have class lessons. You can do the same thing. And then we have tutorials where you can learn about different topics. So you're also more than welcome to take those into your classes and use them in your classes. We have some data set suggestions for you to use. And then we also have a link that shows you who the workshop and hub leaders are for the different workshops and hubs we've done. So we're going to go into class lessons. If you click on class lessons, if you're working along with me, or you can just watch what I'm doing. And these are the different lessons, again, we've created. And we're going to go into the first day lesson first. It's called the first day lesson because the idea is to maybe do it on your first day, but there's nothing says you have to do it on the first day. They actually, I did it just this week. So, and our first day was last week. So any day you want, it's more to introduce your students to data. I'm going to go into this first day lesson. And I have a feeling since I've used it before, I'm going to go ahead and start it again. We can start over from the beginning. So this is a data set that shows people about the number of live births in the United States each year, each day of 2015. We don't have, all the dates are there, but we don't have them all in this lesson, but you can get the data for the other years too. This was created by the CDC. So this is collected by them all the time. And what you'll see in this data set, this is a tiny data set. And that means each row is one measurement, one observation. So we have a date on that date. So January 1st of 2015 had 8,068 births. We also put down what day of the year it is, because sometimes the date isn't as useful as the day of the year. We also have what day of the week it was, and then the year, because you can have different years. And so you can see we have that for 365 entries, because there's 365 days that year. So what I sometimes do with my students, and what I did this semester with my students, is I said, hey, go pick out a date and let's talk about it. And we actually had them pick out particular days, and they all gave the number of births they had that date. And most of them were about the same. And they were like, oh, okay, well, they're all about the same. And then somebody's was different. And one of my students who's a nurse said, oh, that's because doctors don't work on weekends. So we were talking about what kind of conjectures could they come up with from this information. So it allowed my students to actually give that information. And so this gives you some questions which you might be able to propose. This is actually written for an instructor to learn information, but it also, I use it in my classes to talk about. So these are questions I could ask my students of what they think is happening. And so they start having conjectures. And the next page then talks about the point of statistics, why we do it, and what's the point of what we're doing with it, and why we use multivariable data. And And then we started actually graphing it. So this is where I kind of had my students also talk about what the patterns were they saw. What do they see happening here? Again, the student who's a nurse said, oh, because doctors don't want to work weekends, that's why there's 2 bands. But they all were kind of talking about what these bands were about and what was going on. So we talked about why it was and what was going on. Again, this kind of gives you some notes that you can use or think about, and let them go into what's going on. I should mention, this graph is created in R. And the R package that it uses is GG formula, but you don't actually have to have R to do it. This class lesson does everything in it for the information you need. So you don't need to actually have R installed if you don't need it, if you don't have it. My students do have it, so they are allowed to go in and do stuff, but right now they work through this lesson together. And so I then was able to talk to them about what they do, what kind of information you have. My students actually answer the questions of what kind of information do we need to do if we want to create that graph. And so I asked them that kind of information. They're able to answer these questions as we went through it. And again, I kind of saw some of this as duplicates, so I kind of went through it a little fast with some of my students. But this is kind of what I gave them to talk about, and we were able to look into it. The nice thing about this is you don't need R, you just need a browser, which everybody has a browser on their computers. You can also do this on an iPad. It doesn't have to be a computer. So we were able to actually do this in our classes without too much technology. And I actually have a computer where I can show my students what I'm doing. And so they can just follow along if they don't want to log into the computer that's in the class in front of them. And this is what I use to actually help introduce my students to the concept of how R works. So the formula template is what is the best way to teach R. So this was a good way to kind of introduce that idea of how R works. And then the next class period, we actually did some graphs in R by using the same format. And the format is you have a goal, which is where we start. That's what you want to create. So do you want to create a plot? Do you want to find a descriptive statistics? What do you want to do? And so that goes in this first spot. Then you have your Y variable, whatever's on the vertical axis. Then your X variable, whatever on the horizontal axis. And then what your data set's called. And so all you have to do is figure out what goes in each box. So it's just a good way to introduce your students to R if you're going to use R in your classes. Again, I do in my introductory statistics course. And I'm at a community college and we use R all the time in our classes. And so it gives them a really good way to see how that works. And so then all you have to do is figure out what is that goal going to be, and what is your Y variable and what's your X variable, and what data are you coming from. All right, so this is really nice because this one actually kind of has the students now can work through it, where they can actually fill in what they want their goal to be. In this case, we want to do a scatter plot, which is just called point. GF stands for graph function. So graph function and then the point is the name. All graphs will start with GF with an underscore and then whatever you want to do after that, bar, point, histogram, whatever it is you want to do. And so these are nice to help introduce R to your students. So I was able to actually go into here and have my students tell me what should I put in the goal thing. And they're able to look up right here and see what to put in. If they actually had the computers up, they could type it themselves. So into goal, we put in GF point. Y, I asked my students again, what do you want the Y to be? And the Y was bursts, because we're looking at number of bursts as being our dependent variable on the date. So then X would be your date. And then you have to tell it what data set it is. So I asked my students what data set, and they're able to look up in this table and see, hey, it was bursts 2015.
So a lot of, it's Danny here. A lot of people are concerned that they're going to make a mistake in front of the class. And
All the time.
my suggestion is that you just go with it and admit, oh, there's a mistake, let's find it. And there's a slight mistake in this statement here, but if you run it, Kate, you'll see what kind of response you get just to condition people to what the output looks like when something goes wrong.
It's a little slow. Oh, I can see it.
So
Found it.
that's unacceptably slow. I'll have to reset the server.
Okay. So I found
Right there.
My mistake is I spelled burst wrong. And so it will actually come up and give you this neat little error that tells you, hey, it doesn't know what that variable is, doesn't know where it is, because it doesn't, because that variable isn't called birth, it's called bursts. And so it didn't know what I typed. So it's nice because my students actually correct me whenever I type anything wrong. And they're very good at showing me that. So Danny, you're gonna reset.
That's empowering for the students to correct the professor.
Oh, it's great. They love it. Yes. And they do it all the time. And, you know, and we make mistakes all the time. So, Danny, should I just keep going or?
Yeah, I don't know that's on me, that problem. I'll figure out what it is. I set up something wrong.
So all this would do is create the graph we'd already looked at. It basically just reproduces it, but it shows the students how to get that graph. And it starts to introduce them slowly to the R format. And really, if you're new to R format, it really is just whatever you want to do is your goal, whatever your Y variable is, whatever your X variable is, and that is a tilde in between. So you have to explain to your students what tilde is. And then your data equals your bursts. And it would show a beautiful little plot here normally if it wasn't so slow. So we've got a little bit of issue going on with technology. And when that happens in my classes, we just work with it. The other day, I was having my students log into R and a whole bunch of them couldn't get it to log in because our server at work was being too slow with it. So these all things happen. So one of the things that you have to explain is this tilde. Some of the students don't know where it is on their computers, so this just kind of shows where that is. So, and then again, this is R. This little box here is actually using R, and so you can type anything you want to do in this box. So if you want to type in, as it says, bursts, they're not spelling bursts, right? Go to date, and then see what happens. You can actually run the code and see what occurs. Again, it's kind of slow. We're having some issues today with our technology. You never know when technology is going to have its issues.
Well, this is disappointing. You might refresh the page on your browser. That might help.
Yes, I'll try that. All right, and so let's see if that helped. So one of the things that does happen is you become this, oh, there it goes. Okay, so it gives us some information. Just basically.
Could you go back, make the page? Could you make the graph on the previous page?
Yes, I'll go back. So again, our goal was to create a scatter plot, which is called a point graph, for bursts, which is our Y variable. Our X variable was date, and our data was bursts 2015. Oh, because I still can't spell. I obviously cannot spell. So again, you can see it couldn't find it. So it couldn't find that, and you realize what you did wrong, and you go look for it. Oh, shoot. All right, so we'll try this again. And there's
that's what the response rate should be. It shouldn't take seconds and seconds.
Yes. So moving on, because we've got other things I want to show you. There's different things we can do, and one of the questions always comes up is, what else can I do with this? So again, the GF function is what we're using. GF stands for graph function, and so you can do lots of different ones you want to look at. And if we just run this, we can see kind of what it tells us we can do. So if you don't have it all in there, you kind of you just type in what command you want to do. It will then tell you some information about what else you could need, what are some attributes you can put in, what are some different information you can actually do, whether or not you're using a point, or you can actually pick different shapes if you want to, different colors, different fill, different size, and so forth. So these are the different attributes we can do. And what we'd like to do is, again, produce the same graph, but maybe, so this one is asking us to change date to day of the year. And again, what this does is allow students to kind of play around and learn what they can do wrong, and the fact that they can't break it. As I've just shown, you can't break it. And so now you can see there's really no difference here, except that the axis no longer is date, but just the day of the year we're in. And then you can actually change some things. If you want to do births versus date, or date versus birth, let's see what happens when we do date versus birth. Whoops, still can't spell birth. I seem to have a hard time spelling the B. Okay. And you can again see what that graph looks like. And that, again, doesn't give you a whole lot of information, but you do see, again, those two groupings. So it allows students to kind of play around with things and see what information they might get. These are the other types of GFs that we can do. We can do a GF line, which just connects your dots. That's really good for time series. We have a GF linear model, or LM, which actually is a linear model. Regression line, it'll actually plot the regression line for you. GF smooth actually gives you a smooth piece of it. And I have to admit, Danny, maybe you can tell more. I don't use splines, so can't explain what a spline is.
Well, spline is a smooth curve connecting the points. There's so many points here that it's kind of silly to connect them smoothly. But if you just had a hand fill, that would be useful. I don't think it's particularly relevant. But if you do, for example, line, yeah, sure. Do you want to add in color as day of the week, or?
I think that's one of the next ones, but we can go ahead and do that now.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm always.
So if I add in color, and we're going to do weekday.
Yep, you have to say tilde weekday.
That's right, and my students actually told me that. So again, I make mistakes, and my students say, hey, you need a tilde there. And this is only the first day that I was actually teaching them how to use R, and they already got that you needed that tilde there. So I was pretty impressed that they were able to figure that out. So if we do that, now you can see a line graph connecting the points up, and you can see that there are definitely things going on where we have, this is Sunday, and this is Saturday. Actually, I think you can see the way, I think this one's Sunday and this one's Saturday. And then we have the other days of the week. The weekdays are up here. We do have some interesting little drops down, and what's nice about a line graph is it shows you, hey, there was something weird going on these days. So then we have the students talk about why would these days be unusual. And all of my students were able to say, well, this is Memorial Day, this is the 4th of July, this is Labor Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So they would actually come up with those dates and be able to figure that information out. So then we could talk more about the fact that doctors don't want to work weekends and holidays. And it just gives them a chance to kind of talk about that. One of the other things that's in these, and we just did this color thing, but one of the things that's also in here is that you can actually have your students ask questions. And so we can say, does it appear that that's correct? And you can say yes. And then you can submit it, and it does say, hey, yeah, that's correct. If instead I'd said no, it might have given me something different. And then you could have another question where you ask, what happens if you forget to put the tilde before it? And so you can click on that. So let me show you what happens when you say the wrong thing. And that one says, hey, that's incorrect. And then it shows you that it's just not found. So it gives you information. It kind of shows you what the real answer was going to be and kind of tells you you're wrong. So these are just, they're not like quizzes that you give, but it's a good way to assess your students to see how well they're doing, to see how many got an answer or not on this. So that's a good formative assessment that you could be doing during class. And then we can also looking at different years. So like I said, all the years are actually in here from 1969 to 1988. Actually, I'm sorry, this uses those and 2015. So you can actually compare 1978 to 2015 and see what happened in those. So we can go into that information on here. I think we're going to move on to other parts of the webinar. So I'm going to go back to our webinar. But this is just kind of how I taught my students and where we kind of used it. And they got an introduction to data. Like I said, it's called the first day, but you can even do it tomorrow if you wanted to. Or not tomorrow because it's Saturday, but you could do it next week. Just to kind of as an introduction to data. So we go back to the class lesson. That was our first one we were doing. We have another one I also do in my classes. And I'm not going to probably go into as much detail, but it's also, again, back at the StatPREP website, under resources, under class lessons. And this one is called Globe Toss, collecting data. And I like this one because it physically makes them do something in class. I actually bought one of these little globes. If you've gone to one of our workshops, Danny's given these globes out to some people, and it allows you to actually do some work with that, and they actually physically can collect data. And so I like this one a lot for that. Unfortunately, this semester I'm a little running low on time, so I'm not sure I'm going to get to this one. We'll see how things go. But it allows the students to actually, what they're going to do is they're going to throw this globe around the room, and wherever their index finger on their right hand hits, they're going to say whether or not they were on land or on the ocean. And then they can put it into this spreadsheet. So if they click on use the spreadsheet, it'll take them to a spreadsheet, and they can now go and type in their information. So they can say, I was in an ocean. They can actually say what the name of the ocean was. So they can say, yes, ocean. I was in the Atlantic Ocean, which then brings up, do you know your geography, to figure out what landmass you happen to be on. And you can see we already have some data in here from previous semesters. So you can actually keep this, or you can go ahead and clear it out if you wanted to let your students do it differently. But allows your students to kind of have a way to play with it, and then we can plot that data. So if I go back to, Globe Toss, and I go back to this, they've now done the spreadsheet, they're now working with it, and you can actually run the code that will now take and look at that spreadsheet. And so you can now see it's going to give you the first, in this case, the first 10 rows. It actually gives you all of them if you want to go look at them. And you can see, hey, this is the ocean they were in, and this is the name of the ocean. Technically, this is not multivariable data because it's really only one thing they can put in, but you can always change your spreadsheet and ask them for other questions, other answers to go with, and work with that. And then you can talk about cleaning your data. Because if you go back to this, go back to this, I've actually had it where some students do yes with a capital yes, and some students do yes with a lowercase. Some students can't spell specific or different things, so you'll get some problems with this. S Korea, somebody may not think of doing South Korea that way, and so you have to clean your data. So Danny, do you want to talk more about the cleaning data part?
Sure. Well, if you go back to the first page here, so this activity was, I think, developed by Deb Nolan at Berkeley. It's a great activity for teaching about confidence intervals, but that's not, and you may want to use it for that. That's not why you're using it here. So the question that you start with is how much of the Earth is covered by water, and people will say, 68%. Well, they'll Google it and they'll give you an answer. And you'll say, how could you find out whether that answer is correct? How do you know there's not a global conspiracy to inflate the amount of water in the oceans? And so this exercise of tossing the globe is a way of doing sampling. It's not of the Earth. It's hard to get your finger at a random point on the Earth, but of something that we believe represents the Earth. And it's fun. It's very engaging for the students because they're tossing this globe around. But our reason to do it here is not about the water, it's about the data. And if you could, in another tab, okay, bring up that spreadsheet.
Oh, yes, I can do that.
And yeah, perfect. And one of the important things to teach people about data is that there's an organization to data. It's not a difficult organization. And so instructors often think, I don't have to say anything about that. That's obvious to everyone. But it's not obvious to everyone, as I can tell you from my experience consulting with companies and human resources departments and companies which use Excel an awful lot. And awful is probably the active word for how they use it. So this is a spreadsheet. The only technology that you need for this activity, and maybe the only technology that you want to use, is to have at least some students with a laptop or a tablet or a telephone who can follow the link to this document. And when they do, then they'll be able to edit the document. And our main idea is that students, maybe working in groups or something, would add on new cases to this. And as Kate said, you can clean it out if you want, but I think it's kind of nice to start with some runs. And these are all done by actual participants in StatPREP workshops or students of theirs and such. But people can enter their data. Okay, big deal. Then you, as the instructor, if you go back to the tutorial, right, you can show them the data. And one thing that's cool is for them to see that the data changes when they change it in the spreadsheet. So if you were to change the first row or add in a new row, let's do that. Yeah, sure. So just add in a row there and make it maybe, and whatever, just say whatever. That way we'll delete it because it's not going to be authentic. Then go back to the tutorial. When you say run that, there it is, entered into it. So it's always synchronized with what the spreadsheet is. But go on to the next page if you would, Kate. But you as an instructor have these two blocks of code to run. And you don't really have to understand what's going on in the code, except generally they're working aspects of code. And so if you press run, it tells us how many answers there are of each type. And you see now there's an invalid. Someone else had cleaned up these data a little bit. Now there's an invalid answer, maybe. And you'll also run into capital yes and nope, things like that. And the cleaning is about putting it into a consistent form. It works out in data science that acquiring and cleaning data is the vast majority of the work. And to show students, for example, what it means to have a categorical variable and levels of the categorical variable, right? That's been violated here with the ocean because now we've introduced accidentally a new level. That's not what we intended to have. It's not in a standard form. And similarly, so you can have them calculate what fraction of the world is covered by ocean, or at least our estimate of it, just by taking yes and dividing it by the total number of trials. That gives you your estimate. And in a statistics class later on, after you talk about data, another day, another week, you can talk about the confidence interval on that, which is just the ordinary p hat kind of interval. There's other things you can do that are even trickier. But this next one that Kate has done is great because this is showing how much variety there is in the way people actually enter data. And for them to learn that it's harder to work with data if everyone can do their own thing is a valuable lesson on its own. But what to do here, now having pointed that out, is say to the class, okay, could you fix it? Go back to the spreadsheet and find the inconsistencies and fix them. And you'll have to decide on a policy how you want to do it. Are the oceans going to be capitalized or not capitalized? You know, it doesn't really matter how they do it, so long as they do it, the right way. And then every once in a while, you can just rerun this code block, and you'll see that they're making progress, or not, but that they're making progress in consolidating there's 53 different entries here, consolidating those entries just into a few. And so this is an exercise in looking carefully at what the categorical levels are and taking them seriously. And then if you go to the next tab, this is, you know, less important. How much is ocean? Well, here, if you'd run that. Okay, so this is showing the cumulative sum of how much is ocean, right? The first point is saying after the first toss, we thought none of the world was ocean. Well, of course, that's nonsense. But as you move along, the variation gets smaller and smaller. And you can see as we move along that we're settling into something that's close to what Google would have told them. And they're seeing how the variations get smaller as you go along. And something they don't know how to answer, for example, how big is Africa? Right? They could look that up on Google too. We all learned, in my era, we learned how much of the Earth is covered by ocean. But here, what they can do is look to see how many Africas they got. I'm not reading this right. Something's a little bit wrong here. But how many Africa hits there were. And something is just a little bit wrong there. I'm not sure what I did. I'll make sure that's working up right. And you can, of course, set up your own spreadsheet. There's some directions there. If you want to ask your own questions, setting up a spreadsheet is a matter of using Google Spreadsheets. And so these are just instructions for you if you wanted to set up your own spreadsheet to answer a question of your own. And often what instructors do with this is create a spreadsheet, which is their class, and they have students fill in data. You know, how long is your commute? And how far are you from where you were born? And people put in inconsistent entries. You know, if someone is from Asia, they may well put it in kilometers instead of in miles, and someone from the US would probably put it in miles, and all that has to be worked out. So, okay, if you could go back to the slides just for a minute. Okay, if you scroll down to the next one. All right, so let me just, if you go back a slide. So just to summarize, it's really important to work with data in a legitimate format. And statistics books, for typographical reasons, because of the printed format, have tended to treat data as a set of numbers. And partly that's because the calculations that the statistics books do are often done by hand or done on a graphing calculator, and you don't want to enter very much data. But of course, data is more than a set of numbers. There's a context to it. That's very important. But this organization is important for students to see a genuine organization of data. So if all they see about data that they collect in class is tick marks on the blackboard, that gives them a misleading impression. So good to use the technology that's actually used. And it works out that analysis is only a small part of working with the data. So this is an important lesson. You know, if you're thinking that the structure of data is not what statistics is about, well, think what I just said. Data is not what statistics is about. That's an odd claim. And the structure of data, especially in the modern era when there's so much of it, is really important. Kate, go to the next slide. And we've already covered this. You could add more variables. If you want to know if people who catch with their left hand find a different amount of ocean than people who catch with their right hand, well, there's a good way to introduce a null hypothesis, I suppose. And then the next slide. So assessing this is very important. And of course, we talk about two types of assessment, formative assessment and summative assessment. The formative assessment is assessment that helps the students learn. And actually, that feedback cycle where they are changing the entries, correcting them, as it were, cleaning the entries in the table, and then you're showing them what's still wrong, right? That is a kind of formative assessment because it forces them to look carefully at the labels. And it forces them to understand that a capital Africa is different from a lowercase Africa when you're working with data. That's not a profound lesson, but it is an important lesson. And then, of course, there's summative assessment where you want students to demonstrate that they've learned something. And this is actually very nice. In the summative assessment, I wouldn't say give them the spreadsheet and have them go through and correct it. I would say give them a short table of data that aren't tidy, that have mistakes in them. And one of them is to give them data in an old-fashioned format and ask them to put it into a modern case and variable format. We could do a subject of another webinar on that. But just to give them data that's got some coding mistakes in it, or with inconsistent categorical levels, or numbers in different units, or even the units are in the table of data. So it says miles and kilometers and parsecs or whatever it's going to say, right? Those are not proper formats for storing data. And so to ask them to indicate what's wrong with the table is actually a really good form of summative assessment, just to recognize it, not even to fix it. That's going further. And then that link is to some exercises about tidy data that I've been writing for a textbook called Stats for Data Science. But this gives you some examples, or this obviously says draft on it. I'll have to publish it in a more formal way online so people can access it. But it'll certainly give you ideas about the kinds of questions, of summative questions you can ask them about how data is organized and ways in which data is commonly displayed that violate the standard rules of how data is organized. So I think that was that the last slide? Not quite.
Slide. I do want to show you one other thing that's on the website. Going back into the StatPREP website, because there was actually another thing that was created in the class lessons for the globe toss, that if you don't happen to have a globe, you can also use this one here, which was actually created by a gentleman with and he and it seems to be slow work. Oh, there it goes. And it actually will allow you to sample the earth. So you can actually put in some ID, like you could actually have your students put in your college name. And then you could say, I wanted to do so many. So you could have them put their name. So I could put in my name, and then I could ask it to generate a whole bunch of points. And it actually shows you those points that it's going to pick and where they are. And then you can actually see the data of where it picked. And it gives you, again, my name, the point, lat and long, and then you can fill in that spreadsheet, hey, this one is definitely in the ocean, it's in the Pacific Ocean, so this one looks to be on land, US. This one's a little questionable, so you can actually zoom in on it and see where it is. And you can see now that you've zoomed in that it's in the Atlantic Ocean. So it allows you to kind of do it another way using technology and as another way to collect the data. And then I had my students. Go ahead.
Not as fun as tossing a globe.
No,
but
it's not
definitely
fun.
More sophisticated. Yeah.
Not as much fun as tossing the globe, but it also allowed my students. What I did was I tossed the globe around the room and had them collect one piece of data with that, and then had them pick 10 more using this method, and then they got to put that data in also. So they had more data that they could collect besides just tossing the globe around the room. So it's just another way to collect some data. It's just there for them. And actually, I don't think I used this data one at all because I wasn't using the lats and longs, but you could. I was looking more at whether or not it was in the ocean or where it was. And then, like I said, it gives a good chance for your students to go, where in the world is that? What is that spot? Oh, that's that country there. That's in the Middle East. And so then you get some interesting discussions. So it's just another way.
And if I can add, once you start talking about confidence intervals and sampling, activities like this, where you ask them a question that they know there's an answer to, but they don't know what the answer is. So, for example, what fraction of the Earth is Africa? In my class, for many years, I've had students answer the question, how much of the US is within 1 mile of a road? And I ask them to guess first. And some of them will say 1%, and some of them will say 95%. But then to go, and I do it on Google Maps, to go and actually collect data by picking a random point and then zooming in on it is a marvelous way for them to see not only how you collect data, but how the quality of the answer, the confidence intervals, the way we usually talk about, but the quality of the answer is really important. If you have to distinguish between 1% and 99%, you don't need much data. But if you want to distinguish between 40 and 50%, you do need an awful lot of data. So be creative, putting up on the screen a map of a lake in your area and saying, what's the area of the lake? Well, this is a matter of having them blindfolded touch points on the lake, touch points on the map, and did it fall into the lake or not? And then you can read off from the scale. And again, that fundamental statistical issue is, how good is the answer? How would I know whether I've collected enough data? That's what statistics is about. And they see that emerge in a natural way rather than a kind of artificial textbook, or these two groups different way.
Right. And that's what I like about these, is that the students actually get to play with the data and actually be in on it, and not just seeing static data that's in their textbook. And I think they like this and enjoy what they're doing with it. So what we want to know is, we've been talking. Do you have any questions?
If you do have questions, you can type them in the chat box now or the Q&A box. We also have unmuted everybody, so you guys have the option to unmute yourselves and ask away.
So one of the other things while we're waiting for people to ask questions that I kind of want to mention is that that my students, I actually do make my students use R in my classes. This is a good way, both of these are good ways to kind of introduce their students to R and playing with it. The second one doesn't really use R much, but there's a little bit in there. But it's a good way for them to kind of play around a little bit with it. But my students actually do physically use R in our classes, and this is a good way to introduce them to it and let them see kind of how the process works. And again, I remind my students, as they can see, well, as you can see, because I obviously can't type well, that you can't break it. You can make mistakes and you can get errors, but you can't actually break it. And things do work out nicer with that. And then they're correcting me. They're telling me I'm forgetting something, or you spelled something wrong. They're actually able to look at that. So it also is a formative assessment, is how many of my students, and I don't make mistakes on purpose, but how many of my students can look up and see that I have mistakes going on. I am in a classroom that has computers, so my students can actually sit in the computers, but some of them don't like the computers and they bring their own laptops or their own surfaces into the class instead of using the laptops in front of them. So do we have any questions?
No, no questions so far.
Okay.
Oh, Danny. Okay, that was from Danny.
All right. Now I have to admit that my summative assessment that I do for my students after I've done a lot of this, is I do give them a test. And I have to admit, because I don't have any rules at my school, I'm able to give them a take-home test where they can go and play with the data on their own and kind of tell me what they think is happening with the data. I'm very big into tell me what story the graph tells you, because it's not just about producing graphs anymore, it's about using the graphs. That I think we used to teach them how do you create these graphs, but we talked about how to interpret them, and that's what I spend a lot more time on in my classes, is how to interpret it. So I give take-home tests, but you can certainly give in-class tests. Even if you don't have R, you could give them the graphs and ask them the same kind of questions. Because again, we're not caring about producing it as much as we are about using the data and understanding it and interpreting with it. All right, well, I'll wait to see if we have a few more questions, but if you can do us a favor and fill out the survey, the link is right there. It will be in the chat survey, a chat window also. We'd really appreciate you filling out the survey to give us some input on our webinars so we can keep improving them. I don't know when the next webinar will be yet. We haven't scheduled it, but there should be one sometime at the end of February. We'll try to get those scheduled soon, but we don't have those scheduled just yet. And I don't know what the topic's going to be just yet. So if you have any great ideas of things you'd like to see, please put that in the survey, and that will give us a way to kind of see where people have interest in finding out more information.
Do remember that that StatPREP is intended to be a two-way street. That if you have questions or suggestions or great ideas that you're not sure how to implement, talk to us, and maybe it'll be easier for us to implement it than it would be for you. The thing, we try to create activities that we think instructors will find useful, but of course, it's the instructor who's the best judge of that. So feedback that you give us, suggestions, is immensely useful, not just for us, but for the other instructors who are participating in the project.
Well, as an example of that, I need to redo the website a little bit to add in some more information about what each one of the little apps does and what each one of the class lessons does, so that there's more information about why you would do them. So there are more class lessons you can use. There are the little apps. We've had webinars on the little apps, so you can go back and look at the webinar links to see some previous ones, and you'll see discussions about the different little apps that we would do. And gives you a chance to see how to use those things also in your classes. I've tried to use everything that's in the StatPREP. I haven't used everything, but I've tried to use most of it. My students, I think, like it that way, and they seem to be much happier with stuff like that. I'm still learning. I'm still learning everything I can about R, but that's what we're here for, is to teach each other. So if you have any questions.
Nope, no questions.
I have to admit, I'm not a type of teacher who doesn't like to have input from my students, so I have a hard time with this format, but we're doing fine, because I'd rather you ask questions while you were doing things, but that's fine too. All right.
And okay, thank you for setting this up.
You're welcome. And thank you all for participating. And thanks to the MAA for monitoring this webinar. And also thank you for the NSF for funding StatPREP. It is a kind of a group of the ASA, the AMATIC, and the MAA have all gotten together, different representatives from all three of those organizations to do StatPREP. So I think that's a unique group, and I think we should do more of these kind of groups. But thank you, everyone. And thank you, Danny, for being here also.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Hey, and Danny.
Bye-bye, and good luck.
Yes.